All right. Well, this is the third in the series of interviews we're doing regarding humanitarianism. And we have the pleasure of talking today with Christine MacMillan. Christine is a commissioner at WEA and Senior Advisor for Social Justice, as well as the chair of the Global Human Trafficking Task Force. And we're going to talk with Christine about what is human trafficking, some of her experience from her years of work, and specifically some of the work she's doing with the task force, and then a little bit about how this pertains to people in their local communities. So Christine, thank you for doing this. It's really a great pleasure to talk with you. Why don't you go ahead and continue that introduction, please, and tell us about yourself.
Well, when I think about talking with college students, I'm sitting with you many years ago, asking myself the question, what did I want to do with my life? And I found myself being trained in social work. I was involved with the Canadian government, particularly in a municipality in Toronto. I am a Canadian, and you may detect that when I say "a" every once in a while. But I found myself wanting to put my faith, not just in words, but in action. And so I worked for 5 years with the municipal government as a social worker. In those days, you had home visits open to you, and I met an array of families struggling with what appeared to be poverty. But then I began to ask myself questions. So education for me has always been, what is the question I need to ask at the time? What goes beyond the obvious? Following that opportunity to work with the government, I was then, in my own denomination, called into ministry as a Salvation Army officer, as we call them, as a minister. And through that time, I was appointed in a number of countries. I lived in 5 countries. And again, I found myself working on the streets of Vancouver, in the downtown east side. It was highly obvious there were social issues. There were the indigenous, there was prostitution, there were addictions, and I began to train myself up in the environment in which I worked and lived. So I am still an international certified alcohol and drug counselor. I've kept up that accreditation. Some of that work then also led me into establishing with the government in British Columbia, Canada, a home for battered women and children. And so you can begin to see that in my early stages of my career, I was working very much with marginalized persons in my home country. The Salvation Army sent me then to the United Kingdom, and I had the privilege of working with the University of Surrey in the UK. The Salvation Army commissioned a study on homelessness. I had opportunity during that study to enact it with the chief architect of the Salvation Army, who also had his master's in social psychology. So it's wonderful to combine different disciplines. I worked with the Prince Charles Trust, I worked with the government, and the Salvation Army began to look at its services. Is it merely providing housing for homeless? Or is it providing the homeless an opportunity to stretch their hopes and their dreams in such a way that they become participative in their own wave of the future? Some of that work included finding a cold weather shelter, as the government called it then, an abandoned building in the heart of London, England, that we hired staff very quickly. We found the street homeless coming into our environment, and we were asked to create an environment that was not institutionalized, but gave people the freedom. They could bring their dogs, they could choose what they wanted to eat. And so I began to understand the value of choice for people living in marginalized communities. And again, their participation in their destiny. Coming back to Canada, I was in an administrative position in our social services department, and then got sent to Australia as the program director for the Salvation Army in that country, which included the church and social services, two branches of the expression of the Salvation Army. So that brought me into another realization. How does the church become active with its creed? How does it live out its creed? But the biggest shock of my life came in my career when I received a call from the world leader of the Salvation Army, who told me I had a conviction. Now, always be worried when people tell you they have a conviction. And he sent me as the leader of the Salvation Army to a country called Papua New Guinea, a country that's one of the poorest countries in the world, where there is tremendous sense of tribal unity and disunity at the same time. Lots of violence, and yet an expression of Christian faith through schools, through hospitals. And there I learned to understand what it meant not to bring my white culture or my Western culture, but to understand deeply the heart of a people and the vulnerabilities of a people, but also the celebration through music, through the arts, and through the church. Following that, I was then appointed as the leader of the Salvation Army in Canada and Bermuda. And here I am in a position, not necessarily one I would choose for myself, but with corporate responsibility, both for the spiritual heart of the Salvation Army and its corporate demands and responsibilities. I had 11,000 employees, and trying to lead this movement where the Salvation Army provided more social services than any other agency or NGO next to the government. That was challenging, but to say the least, I then got called back as a Salvation Army officer. You're available. And I was called by the general then to commence a whole new work called the International Social Justice Commission. The Salvation Army's history, and when we talk about human trafficking, David, the Salvation Army's history was to understand that human trafficking was something it understood as early as the 1880s. And it established itself a technical legal case where they tracked a woman through a court system who had been trafficked. And they pointed out both to the court and the newspapers and society in the UK that women were being trafficked. It was called in that day the white slave trade. And so as a result of that, the Salvation Army developed its justice voice. It walked into the seat of government, the Houses of Parliament, literally with a petition on its shoulders of thousands of signatures to change the age of consent. And what that meant, the age of consent for young women getting involved in relationships, with sexual relationships. And to this day, that law is still on the books in the UK. So you see, I'm not just telling you about a career path, I'm telling you about a history that I had to learn and understand and live with and be inspired by. When I retired from the Salvation Army, I got 2 phone calls. One, if I would work in social justice with the World Evangelical Alliance, and would I work in social justice with Lausanne. The World Evangelical Alliance phoned me first. And at that time, they were also very interested in the topic of human trafficking. Now, how that commenced is a story in and of itself. And this is just not about my career path. This is about human trafficking itself. I was in Thailand, and I was there at an event that the World Evangelical Alliance put on. I had talked to the Secretary General for the World Evangelical Alliance briefly about trafficking. Just a sidebar conversation. In that event, somebody stood up, a young man, and said, "What is the World Evangelical Alliance going to do about human trafficking?" And from the stage front center, Jeff Tunnicliffe, the Secretary General, said, "Is Christine MacMillan in the room?" Now, I felt like running out of the room, but I knew what he was going to ask me in a very public place. And he said, "Would she stand up?" And I stood up. He said, "This is the woman that's going to help us with human trafficking." And in the hallways after that session, people gathered around me, and we began the embryonic stages of a task force called human trafficking. But before we get into the subject at depth, I want to suggest to you that the environment in which I was staying in Thailand, our hotel was flooded with people who were sitting in hallways, young women. There seemed like fairly orchestrated engagements going on. And these were called traffickers. There were, I understand, in the center of this community, 20,000 prostitutes. And so again, the question, why and how did this happen? So I want you today, in thinking about this topic, to start bringing it home. Because I discovered there was a boat that drew up in the 1950s to this Thailand sleepy fishing village. And off the boat came some sailors in beautiful white uniforms. And they had money in their pocket. And they spoke English. And they were on their way to the war in Korea. And they were American sailors. And they had time on their hands, and they had money in their pockets. And they looked at those beautiful girls from Thailand and introduced into that fishing village. As a result of that boat drawing up, I am told, prostitution began to take root. And so, friends, we are not talking about a topic where we don't have responsibility in our own hands when we talk about trafficking. And so that always impresses me, that we're talking about a topic that refers to victims, but victims are there because of the demands placed on potential victims from our own societies.
Thank you for that introduction, Christine. Just reading a little bit, the UN says that human trafficking is the third most profitable crime in the world. And that not only is it huge, anywhere from 20 to 37 million people caught up in human trafficking, but they say that it's growing. I mean, does that scale and the fact that it's growing, is that consistent with what you see in your work? And why do you think it's growing?
If you took the equation of profitability out of human trafficking tomorrow, it would dry up. It's growing because it is very lucrative monetarily. You think about the drugs that are exchanged and sold and bought on the streets. A drug is consumed and it's gone. You think about a person being trafficked. A person can be used again and again and again. And so when we talk about human trafficking, we're talking about people who have a lifetime to give in captivity, whether they're trafficked into labor situations, whether it's their organs, whether it's sexual exploitation. So it's growing because it's very lucrative. And one of the things you'll be surprised at is that in sexual trafficking, the traffickers now, a little over half are women who were trafficked themselves. And so it's a business. It's an industry. It's an industry that's thriving. It's a global industry. And there is a demand for it. And so as long as there's a demand for it, it will continue to thrive.
Is it thriving in North America also? Do you see that?
It is. It's thriving because the countries that have the resources to bring in those who are trained to work in either labor slave conditions or exploitation, we have the money to pay for it. We have the resources to consume it. And so that's that. So we are known as a country who's both a destination country, and you'll understand this in human trafficking parlance. In other words, we can receive the benefits of trafficking because we pay for it. We also like things on the cheap. And so, you know, we heard about the old days of sweatshops and how unions were developed, but these are sweatshops that we cannot see. Trafficking is very hidden. It's very clever. And all of a sudden it finds itself on the shelves of the goods, and there will be always people willing to purchase a good bargain, a good deal. Mm-hmm. And then sexual exploitation can be in places that massage parlors, for example. In San Francisco, there's a number of massage parlors. So you'd say, well, that's a massage parlor. What's that got to do with trafficking? But if you walked into some of those places, you'd see mattresses, wall-to-wall mattresses, and the massage turns into sexual trafficking. And it's allowing for more money to be spent. But one of the ways in which it's thriving as well on our most vulnerable citizens in the United States and Canada. In Canada, our Indigenous people are trafficked from the north. And in the United States, when you talk about runaways, for example, you ask yourself the question, what is the vulnerability of runaways? Many runaways run away because they've been sexually abused, because they could be dealing with orientation issues, and they feel unaccepted in their own community. They're running away from trauma. And they find themselves on the street, and somebody befriends them. He says, well, I've got a place where you can stay. And they find themselves literally being trafficked, perhaps weeks later, after all the favors are given to them. And traffickers are very astute at knowing how to detect vulnerability.
We use the example of sexual trafficking, and but there are other forms of trafficking, so to speak. For example, would we consider child soldiers within the scope of human trafficking, and maybe other things as well?
Yes. So child soldiers are being used in times, obviously, of war. What child has a right or the capability to sign up to become a soldier? When you're 10 years old, you don't say, I want to learn how to be a soldier. You have something else in mind if you're in school. So you're taken out of school. A gun is being put into your hands, and you're trained, and you're very obedient. And they make very good, those who are captured and become soldiers. They become, in some ways, when we're young, we learn a skill that we never forget, and we get better at it. They're also victims. They're throwaways. So there are situations where children, they have bombs put on their back, and they're told to run into an area, and that bomb goes off and the child dies. So they're commodities that are utilized and used with no consideration for any choice.
Mm-hmm. Recently in the news here in the US, there was a story about some of the people coming into the country illegal from the South who were told that there were jobs waiting for them. Yeah. And so they get moved up to the north, and in this example to Ohio, and put to work at a chicken producing place, and told they had to stay there and they had to work until they paid back the cost of bringing them in to the US. Is that also an example of human trafficking?
That is an example, and that's all written out in the protocols. When you think of human trafficking, it's about coercion under false pretenses. And it's then the exploitation of an individual with a false promise. And then you transport or you move that person, and then the word they use is harbor them. You keep them in a situation, and then you hold them captive. So trafficking, it's going from one place to another, and putting people in a situation where they then become vulnerable and used. And so it's like moving goods. It's like moving people like chattels into an ideal situation for the trafficker in order to make money. So there are people being trafficked who you will never see. You will never see them. They live 24 hours a day in a room, and maybe they walk out of that room and they sew jeans for 14 hours a day. And what we're finding is that men and young boys who've been trafficked in the labor world, very often we look at women and children, but there's more research now taking place on what happens, the trauma effects on men, and it's different. I have been involved and seen where men are taken out of a labor trafficking situation, and they absolutely cannot speak for weeks on end. Their whole sense of who they are is absolutely demoralized, and they just feel like little children. And so we need to acknowledge that this issue of labor trafficking, it's not, to the extent of sexual exploitation, but it's very much a growing sense of an issue because of economic challenges. And the advertising, the false advertising to get people, and you need men to do heavy work, is increasing all the time.
Mm-hmm. We tend to think of children and young girls when it comes to sexual trafficking. There's also labor trafficking, as you're saying, and there's a majority of boys and young men, I think, get trafficked in that situation. Yeah. And so it affects, boys and girls, men and women, apparently.
Oh, yes, yes. Now, it's when I talk about a lucrative business, it's worth $150 billion a year. 99 billion of the 150 billion is in sexual exploitation, but that's still a considerable amount in other forms of trafficking.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a report coming out of the Caribbean that as the economy in Venezuela begins to collapse, or it has collapsed, that people are coming out of Venezuela into Colombia, but also coming into the Caribbean, and that traffickers were gearing up to be able to exploit these vulnerable people into the whole human trafficking system. So it seems that there's a connection to different kinds of disasters. Disasters create vulnerable people, and then human traffickers take advantage of them. Is that consistent with what you see?
Very consistent. So, when the earthquake struck in Haiti, for example, all the tents go up for accommodation, and there's a human trafficking tent. So what traffickers do, they capitalize on vulnerability. They're very clever at knowing what people's needs are. And what shocked me one day when I sent a group, it's when I was the leader of the Salvation Army in Canada, and our women's groups in our churches raise money so much a year to send to a different country for a project. And I challenged them. I said, why are you just sending money? Why don't you go yourself and see what's going on? So they went, and they brought back show and tell pictures. And the picture that shocked them the most was there were 5 mothers standing behind their young children. These mothers were illiterate, but every one of those mothers knew exactly what their child was worth on the open market of trafficking. They went to the church, these mothers, but They absolutely knew that there was a possibility that their kids would be taken. There was also a possibility in their minds, if you've got 5 kids, maybe 4 would be better if one could be trafficked. And so that conversation led to another conversation. I think we're now getting into, how do you begin to address these challenging ways of manipulation in getting, people trafficked. The Salvation Army in Tijuana, south of the California border, was saying to me as the leader of the Salvation Army in Canada, we've got a trafficking problem here. There are limos that are driving into Tijuana from California late at night and picking up these kids and using them. They were like it was like rent a child through the night. They would have their customers in the vehicle with them, and then they discard these kids. So you start asking questions, right? Asking the question. And so I asked, well, where is their parental guidance? What's going on? Are these kids running out of the house? And they said, well, most of them are living with single moms, and their moms work shifts and they work all night. I said, oh, that's interesting. And they said to me, we need to build a shelter for these women and children. We need to obviously remove them from their place of residence. And my mind began to see an institution. I thought that's going to be very expensive. It's going to only serve a few. So I said, we had this conversation. I said, well, the issue seems to be between midnight and 7 in the morning, right? Yes, they said. So our response was, we built a daycare center that operated from midnight to 7 in the morning. The women could go to work. The children were in a safe place at night. The limos that drove in didn't see any kids on the street as their parents were working. And it saved, probably that 24-hour daycare center saved millions of dollars in building an institution that would only save a few, and it addressed the issue.
Mm-hmm. So now, is that some of the work that you're doing with the Human Trafficking Task Force? Is that the kind of things, or what else does what is the Human Trafficking Task Force, and what is that?
The Human Trafficking Task Force is made up of individuals who live in other parts of the world. They live in different regions of the world. And when I got that question, stand up, Christine MacMillan, we gathered together. I can remember our first meeting in 2009. I was still with the Salvation Army as the director of the International Social Justice Commission. And we said, well, what are we going to do? What is this about? So we had to realize that our constituency, or our resource, was the local church in the World Evangelical Alliance world of national alliances. So there's a national alliance. There are about 134 national alliances. So that was our resource, was congregations. It was not then our intention to become an NGO. It was our intention to use our resource. And out of that, we developed some objectives that could be applied to any situation. And they were more questions in some ways than objectives. So first of all, how do we get people in the church involved? Well, we need to give them some kind of conviction. So we developed a biblical foundation for engagement. And there's a one-pager on what it means to be involved with justice issues. What does it mean for Luke 4 to become true for us? That the Spirit of the Lord is upon us to set captives free. So we realized we had to create for the church a sense of conviction. Our other objective is to listen to stories and get others to listen. We found that people in the church would find it hard to believe that these incidents actually took place under the noses of their own communities. So part of our acceptor or question would be is, do you have any stories? Can you extract some stories from your community? Our third objective is, and I'm continuing to look at this, is to find ways to develop strategic networks. And so we have around the world, coming out of the churches, strategic networks with other denominations, even some multi-faith strategic networks, to do what we can do best. Now, what would those things be? Well, first of all, trafficking takes different expressions in different parts of the world, according to the vulnerabilities. And when I have met with government leaders in various countries of the world, they say, oh, well, you're from the church, we understand you have an expertise in human trafficking, we've got a big problem in our nation. And so they'll say, what can we do? So we begin to make ourselves available as a voice into the community. We find some prayerful ways of strengthening that conviction. So for example, there can be one day a year where you amalgamate all the resources and ways in which you inform people on how to discover what is human trafficking in their own community. And so you're focusing the church on something very specific in order to educate them and give them a voice. And so you'll find this interesting because when I met with these government leaders and they're calling the church in, they're desperate. They don't know what to do with these issues. And I'll tell you why they're desperate. And this is where I believe the church can help. We're able as a global organization to view how different nations address this issue. In my own country of Canada, we have laws on our books that are very specific to human trafficking issues. Now, why do I say that's important? If you're going to address human trafficking, you have to find a way to address the traffickers through a criminal justice system. If not, you don't have any means by which you can rescue people who've been trafficked. And so we have national laws that came from the floor of our parliament, you would call it your Senate, where a Christian woman parliamentarian raised the issue, got the churches behind her, and now there are laws in Canadian society against human trafficking. I can tell you in the United States that your trafficking laws are more state-based than federal-based. And that, I think, is a challenge because trafficking knows no boundaries. It merges itself through boundaries. And so then you ask, we as a human trafficking task force help churches find out what legislation there is in their communities, in their countries, in order to address this issue. And when you start talking about legislation with government sectors, you then are raising awareness at the level of power where something can be done about it. And if those nations are part of the UN, you then are providing the resources. So you're coming at this and saying to yourself, we as the church need to be prophetic and we need to publicly engage with our government to say, this issue needs legislation. It's important enough, it needs to be addressed. Now, what happens when the legislation is on the books? So you train up those folks that are in the justice system, and let's say they go into a brothel or a trafficking setting, and they capture the victims. Maybe the trafficker has gone off, but they bring all the victims to the police station. And they don't. And these people are traumatized. They're crying. Where do you put them? And so governments will say to us, and I have a response to them, well, we've got the law, we've got the correctional justice people trained, but we don't know what to do with the victims. We know we can lock up the trafficker. We can't lock up victims. They're victims. And so that's where we as the church, in many, many incidents, have trained volunteers to accompany the correctional justice system and to be the human face and to sit with people in trauma and to make it possible and to establish shelters and to establish a way of receiving victims so that the correctional justice personnel aren't afraid to do their job.
So I'm hearing a couple of different important activities, and let me see if I captured them correctly. So first of all, it sounds like you're describing advocacy, giving voice to these people, capturing their stories and sharing their stories, and through that advocacy, raising awareness. Then it sounds like you're also recruiting people to work together, creating networks. So not just an individual church, but maybe a set of churches in an area may begin to coordinate.
Yeah.
For example, we have the story recently of a group of churches in Tucson in the midst of this situation where children are being separated from their parents as they come across the border. Yeah. The churches formed a network, and one of the churches in the network created a facility, made a space available for children to stay, while the others worked on advocacy and support and fundraising and so on. So it sounds like part of the work of the task force is to engage and then help to set up these networks. Does that sound right?
Yeah, and so the way you set up networks is through training as well. So I've been in countries where we've held 2 and 3 days of training with churches coming together. You also have the government present. And there's a credibility for the church that is just not against people who we think are bad in our community or are causing problems. But we actually are astute enough to be able to be trained up and train the church to do what they do best, whether it's accompaniment, if there are Christian NGOs, to be volunteers with the NGOs, but to be a place in the community, as you say, David, that has a voice of advocacy, but also has a voice of practical accompaniment and presence as the church.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned the UN. So part of it is in terms of legislation that makes this a crime and then gives you a basis for action against the traffickers. But it's also a violation of human rights, and that's where the UN comes in?
Yes, and there's a protocol. And when you're part of the UN as a member state, you are expected to follow that protocol. It's partly the definition of trafficking, smuggling, all different aspects of human trafficking. And what you hope to do is create cooperation across boundaries and borders. Mm-hmm. And I also was instrumental in establishing in my work with the UN, and I continue to do that in the early days of starting the Salvation Army International Social Justice Commission. We established a civil society or NGO committee on trafficking, and it still meets every month. And what the UN relishes and invites is they want civil society to speak into the need for certain kinds of protocols and to raise the grassroots issue from the ground and say what actually needs to be done. Now, a third of the people that were on that committee are people who work in faith communities, which I think is very, very interesting. Mm-hmm. And so it's having your voice at the highest level of global influence, but bringing then that global influence into protocols, into grassroots action and advocacy and response.
Mm-hmm. Could you say a little more about the UN piece? So I understand your background with Salvation Army. how that got you into the social justice issues, and then specifically in human trafficking with the WEA. How did you begin then to also engage with the United Nations?
Well, interestingly enough, the Salvation Army, when the UN wanted civil society peace, I believe in the 1950s, there were 17 founding civil society entities that became part of the UN in terms of speaking into it, and the Salvation Army was one of them. So when I started the International Social Justice Commission, the UN piece was obviously an important platform for us to work through. At present, the World Evangelical Alliance has teams in Geneva and New York that are part of ECOSOC, which means we're part of a group of NGOs who work in conjunction with the United Nations on conferences, on speaking into certain issues in committee work. I was just at the UN last week, and we were talking about how to action the Sustainable Development Goals. I was I'm chairing a refugee task force for the World Evangelical Alliance, writing a paper on how best the World Evangelical Alliance, with its task force on refugees, can help the international protocols that the UN is developing for 66 million refugees. So what it does is we have a credibility and a voice because we've learned to articulate our grassroots churches with an intelligence that can go to work. And then we develop those papers, but how important it is, then that paper becomes a mirror and reflection for the church to go to work. Our papers can be high and lofty and idealistic, but they provide that opportunity to say, well, are we, it's like the Bible, you know, it's high and ideal and long, you know, it's something that we work towards. And so always with global work and campaigns and ideals and papers, you then have to interpret that on the ground and be a church that not only is concerned about the Sunday morning sermon and the color of the carpet on the floor, but are we people of invitation? Are we people that build walls, or are we people that knock them down and say, come on in?
It sounds like your experience has put you into a very unique position where you can speak into the global entities like the UN or to national governments about the issue, but then translate down to the local level at the same time. You're really speaking in those two directions there, so to say.
Yeah, well, you know, for those of us who can name scripture, for God so loved the world, well, we can recite that again and again, but my question is, what difference does it make to the world? And so the whosoever believes, you know, you and I know that for people who are trafficked, there are two questions that we cannot change the answer to: where we were born and who our parents are. And so we have to acknowledge that in our society, there are vulnerabilities that you and I will never have to live with. And we do not want to be an evangelical community, and particularly the word evangelical is going through a bit of a rough brush these days. So when I'm at the UN, I don't automatically put out my hands and say I'm from the World Evangelical Alliance. I get involved in dialogue. And people come up to me and say, oh, can we have your card? And then, oh, you're from the World Evangelical Alliance. So it's creating a credibility for the gospel that says we are more interested in encompassing our faith message with others than shutting them out. And yeah, that's a challenge to me. To me, it's a challenge not only to speak into the UN or the World Bank or global tables, but to speak into the church with the fact that the gospel is inclusive and transformational at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. You know, speaking about how the church can engage, You've provided some great examples in terms of thinking about where are these people going to go if we take them out of that situation, or being a presence, coming alongside people. I was also struck by your description of the young men who are traumatized and being unable to speak. These experiences have long-term consequences. So when we think about that trauma, how else can a church minister to people who've been exposed to this?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we need to acknowledge that we don't ask the question, what's wrong with you? We more ask the question, tell me about your story. So we hear a lot about storytelling these days, but Jesus was very good at drawing out and building trust for stories to be shared over time. And I think one of the greatest gift and resource that we're horrible at ourselves is the ability to sit and listen and to build trust and to unravel layers of experience in people's lives that they have found themselves reliving. You know, if we understand that there's a thing called, and David, you're a psychologist, traumatic bonding. So even a trafficked person can feel like it's their fault. And we talk about something simple like forgiveness in the church. Don't think that somebody who's been trafficked or abused or has gone through an experience of being treated like a slave is going to understand forgiveness in an hour's sermon on Sunday morning. These are complex issues. If we relish in the good of the gospel, then we need to begin to understand what it is addressing. And so I've talked to people who've been trafficked, and they say there's not a day goes by that their mind does not go back to that situation. Can I give you an example that breaks my heart every time I think about it? When it's a Salvation Army thing, but Salvation Army is part of the World Evangelical Alliance. We're not talking about a branding of an organization right now. We're talking about who we are as Christian people in building the kingdom. I was asked to go to Sri Lanka to do some teaching to pastors. And I had a couple of hours, and they brought me to a place where the Salvation Army was involved in under one roof. It was like a one-stop service. I couldn't believe it. They had elderly people there. They had people there with mental health problems. If we were studying social work in our nation and we saw this place, we'd say, what in the world are they doing? But they were and the Salvation Army minister lived in one room at the front of this place and ran this place. I don't know how she did it. But it was looking at the human society in all of its vulnerabilities as I went from one room. There was AIDS babies. And then the last room I went into, I heard this loud music playing. I was in a white Salvation Army uniform, like a suit, a Western suit. And I came in and they said to me, because you wear white in hot climates, by the way, but they said to me, we're going to introduce you to these girls. They were girls about 13 and 14. And they said, then they gave me some indicator that these girls at 5 years of age were trafficked to the Middle East. And they're worn out, and they somehow they got sent back, and they landed in the hands of the courts in Sri Lanka. And they didn't know what to do with them. And so they phoned up the Salvation Army, and the Salvation Army took these girls. When I walked into the room, they were dancing to this very loud music. And they introduced me, first of all, from New York City. Well, they screamed when they heard New York City. And they just looked at me. They had no idea what I represented, or all they knew was I was from New York, and maybe I was hip and I was cool. And they said to me, would you dance with us? And, I thought, well, sure, I'll dance with you. And I began to realize that their understanding, since they've been 5 years old, the only way they could express themselves to me, or to anybody to that matter, was sexually. And I began to realize what was taking place. And, maybe we're uncomfortable with this conversation. But I walked out of that room about 25 minutes later, and I said to myself, prevention, prevention, prevention. And so what the Human Trafficking Task Force does is it gathers Sunday school teachers together in different countries and says, you need to be aware of human trafficking, or youth leaders, or school teachers, because I think about these girls often and think they are so far gone in their ability to relate or understand human relationships. They've been so schooled and traumatized that we cannot afford just to be rescuing victims. We have to find ways of this situation of trafficking never happening in the first place. And I came out of that room and I said to myself, what's human about trafficking? It's barbaric.
Yeah, that's a really moving story. I'm hearing a couple of points for the local church and the things that you're describing. First, that rescuing someone out of that situation is not the end of the problem. As you say, these people have been through something that they will carry with them the rest of their lives. And so helping them is going to be a long-term process. And because of that, the need to keep people from having that problem in the first place. So then it also sounds, again, thinking about the local church, is to be aware of just how this problem is everywhere. In any city of a significant size in the world is likely to have some element of human trafficking going on. And furthermore, that this is an exploitation of the most vulnerable. So anything that creates vulnerable people is likely then to become an environment that's ripe to be exploited by human traffickers. So natural disasters creates vulnerable people who are exploited by human traffickers. Even though those people originally may not have been caught up in this, then it becomes a place where this can begin to happen.
Yeah.
What other things come to your mind if you were to give some advice to a local church or group of churches?
I was just speaking 2 hours ago to one of our task force members named Martin, who lives in Zambia. And you'll meet Martin next week, David, in the Philippines. We'll see him there. Martin, and this sounds so unusual, but the church needs to examine itself as well and feel comfortable with this topic. It can be very uncomfortable. It also needs as many men and women to be involved in standing up on the issue. And this is not about the women's sewing circle of the church being just involved. This is an issue of crime. This is an issue of vulnerability that all of society needs to speak up. So Martin has designed a program, and he works with men in the church to talk about their comfort level in relationships. And I think, the church is getting a bit of a challenging rap these days on its own record of serving with clean hands and a clean heart. And my suggestion to you that the topic of human trafficking puts the mirror back on the church on how do we ourselves address our own relationships? What are we comfortable with? And do we have the goods in our own lifestyle to be authentic, to have an ethic that people can be proud of? And is our ability or our inability to deal with power and structure, even in our own evangelical communities, something that's going to complement or address the power of human trafficking. So I find that this is a topic that maybe brings us up a bit. It creates for us a conscience. So if you as an individual or as a church want to get involved in this, it's not being a hero who rescues others. It's ensuring that we ourselves are living lives that are clean, that are comfortable. And so I've just, in another meeting yesterday, talking in a part of the world, in the evangelical community where they don't want to get involved with this. Some of the women do, but the leaders of the churches don't want to get involved. They don't feel comfortable with it. And so it's not a case of being critical of the men who don't want to get involved. They feel vulnerable themselves. And so my suggestion is for churches that want to get involved, they need to find a place of comfort amongst their own community to talk about these issues.
So if they're going to do advocacy, it sounds like you're saying, first, make sure your own house is in order, and then develop that voice, begin to exercise that power that you can have in the community to speak with some moral authority.
And make sure that, we all know people in church congregations who have all of a sudden disappeared. They haven't necessarily been trafficked, but they've somehow had issues in their lives that they haven't been able to speak about. I mean, you're going to get, if you're going to open up your doors to people who've been trafficked in some form or another, you're going to be hearing things you've never heard in your lifetime. And so, I think it's a case of you can train people up for specialty areas of recovery or things like that, but it's also not being foolish. I've known people who have taken in freshly rescued trafficked people who have been sexually exploited and have found them sleeping with their own children and been horrified. Well, you have to be wise about this. And so it's a case of being mature and adult about talking, with professionals. What can we expect? What are the signs after the rescue? And so to do what we can do best and not, to understand what the captivity journey has done to people and not to make ourselves vulnerable. It's almost like we become traumatized with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Does anything come to mind, maybe just to begin to wrap this up, if somebody wants to know more, they want to become in this field, or the church wants to begin to do something, what kinds of resources are available to them?
Yeah, well, there's lots of training for churches, and what is, first of all, maybe the training and the objectives is to find themselves, first of all, introducing the topic to the congregation to wanting to become involved, and maybe inviting somebody who works in the field to a small group meeting. But there are training programs in different languages, in different countries that help the church get on board. So one of the ways in which those training programs help the church get involved is asking the right questions. Maybe it's starting off with finding out what, if there isn't legislation, is to campaign for legislation. Maybe there is a shelter and they need volunteers. Maybe it's understanding that in our Sunday school, we want to make sure that the vulnerabilities of our community are finding ways for their children to be part of our community. And if it's not Sunday morning at 9:30, then we're going to do a Wednesday evening group. So you think about prevention and just not think about the rescue aspect. Because human trafficking basically is a symptom of a lot of other things. economic deprivation, people looking for solutions to situations that already exist that aren't working. And so they're walking into a pitfall that they think is a solution, and it becomes a captivity in their lives. And also having eyes, there's all kinds of methodologies in giving for us eyes and ears to pick out and to identifying human trafficking in our community. I had to speak at a golf club to one of the wealthiest families who sponsored this in Canada. And they came to the event. There were professors there from universities, there were entertainers there, and I was the guest speaker. And they were traumatized. I said, "What's wrong?" They said, "The police were next door to our house," and they lived in a mansion of a home. They said they were next door, and they were making all these arrests. And it was a trafficking den. It was an estate. It was a house probably worth $5 million running, and they had no idea. It was under their noses. And it was somewhat humorous in some ways that here I was speaking the same day about creating awareness and this. So we ended up talking about it. And so there's ways of even becoming eyes and ears in your own community to ask the right question. You know, if I go and get my nails done, I always engage in conversation with nail parlors because they can be trafficked.
Yeah.
And you ask people where they eat, where they sleep. If you see an entity and you don't see people moving back and forth, and yet it's a large place. I mean, there are ways of training people up to find out what's going on.
Yeah. Tell me if you think this is fair to say, but any ministry that works with vulnerable people, which by definition would be most ministries, would be wise to be aware of human trafficking, the signs of human trafficking, and how the people they're ministering to potentially become targets of human traffickers.
Yeah. Thanks for that, David, because can I tell you, people who are trained in social work or psychology or the health field need to know this, as you know, the symptoms of cancer or something else. They need to be trained specifically in this, and they're not. So it needs to become part of the curriculum. It needs to become a part of the curriculum for medical school. It is a type of industry that's very clever. It's very good at its advertising. And it's very good at getting the goods, and it's making lots of money. And it's ongoing. Somehow we haven't figured it out.
The numbers are pretty staggering. I mean, if those estimates are right, then the numbers approach similar numbers to the total displaced people in the world. I mean, the scale of it, rivals the scale for refugees.
But I'm reminded, David, that's what we know. It's what we can't count everything. But when you talk about refugees, what we're finding now in the field of human trafficking, as you described with respect to vulnerabilities when there's a disaster that strikes, then human trafficking moves in. We have almost 66 million refugees and displaced persons. Every one of those 66 million are candidates to be trafficked. In fact, they are being trafficked. We know that if you're standing on an embankment and you're wanting to go from A to B, it could be called smuggling, and you'll pay $1,000 to go, 10 minutes in a boat. It's taking advantage of others. And so raise your justice voice, be prophetic, be an Isaiah, be a Jeremiah, and be as incensed about that as you're incensed about the morality or the immorality of your neighbors.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Christine. So is there anything that you want to say to people listening to this before we close?
I've got a scriptural reference there. If you don't think this has got anything to do with your faith community, listen to Isaiah 42. But this is a people plundered and looted, all of them trapped in pits or hidden in prisons. They have become plunder with no one to rescue them. They have been made loot with no one to say, send them back. And my challenge is, I want to get to know the people I cannot see and I cannot hear. And I want to be the answer to their prayers. And so my challenge to all of us in this day and age in which we're living in, that the prayer of Jesus, that we would all may be one, it says so that the world will know. I pray that the world of human trafficking will know that in our unity and in our diversity, we will have an ability to infiltrate this evil, this darkness. And for me, what is a terrible sadness on how people are living day after day.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Christine. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me.
Wonderful. Thank you, David.